All right, so welcome back. So we're going to start looking at the different parts of the brain. So we're going to start off with the brainstem, and then we're going to kind of go from like lower brain areas up to the cerebrum. All right, so in the brainstem, remember the brainstem has three parts. We have the medulla oblongata, sort of about here-ish. We have the pons, which is located right about here, and then the midbrain, which is located right in here. All right, so we're going to talk about those three parts. All right. So I'm going to hide me here so you can see a little bit better. All right, so in the medulla, so again, that's the area right down in here. And I really like this image because it gives you an idea of where this entire midbrain is in an individual. So again, that medulla would be somewhere right about in here. Okay. It has these two sort of, I guess, you can call them separations or separate clusters, if you will. We have what are known as the pyramids, and then we have the nuclei. So the pyramids, so it's this, I guess it's like an enlargement on the medulla. What these are corticospinal tracts. So if you remember back to our definitions, tracts are simply what we would consider nerves, but in our central nervous system. So we don't call them nerves anymore, we call them a tract. So these are corticospinal tracts, meaning that they're going to take information from the brain, from the cortex, down to the spine. Okay, and whenever you're going from the cortex, from the brain down to the spine, what we're going to have is some sort of movement type activity. So in this case, they're taking information about voluntary movements to the limbs, so your arms, legs, and then your trunk, like your torso. All right. The interesting thing is, or one of the interesting things is you have something, these tracts decussate in the pyramids. Now you're like, what the heck is a decussate? Or what is decussation? Decussation is going to be the fancy pants word for crossing over. Okay? So basically these tracts, they're coming down from the cortex, and then right at those pyramids, they crisscross. That's all it means. So where they cross, where tracts cross, where nerves cross, again, these are tracts, we don't call them nerves. Where they cross, however, that's considered a decussation. And you'll see that term more often than not when we talk about the nervous system. So in your future studies, you see that that's what that means. Okay? So that'll be kind of key because that's one of the things that's going to cause, like the right side of your brain actually controls the left side of your body, and then the left side of your brain controls the right side of your body. So it's due to this crossing over. Okay? And then if you remember, here's the other term we had learned about last time on one of the previous lectures, is the term nuclei. So basically a nuclei, just as a reminder, is a cluster of neuron cell bodies. Okay? And when you have a cluster of neuron cell bodies, usually they're going to have a specific function. So these nuclei, you can see here, there are 4 of them, they're going to control these 4 different things. So, for example, one cluster of neurons is going to have important input going into the cardiovascular system. So basically regulating heart rate, for example. Another center, another set of neurons is going to be important in breathing. And you'll learn more about this also in 202. Okay, so there's going to be a respiratory center. Okay, so you'll notice that the very basic kind of things for your body to survive, heart and breathing, these are controlled by this medulla, or it's going to have a lot of input. We'll see the pons also plays a little bit of a role. So you can basically be unconscious, but your heart and your breathing still continue. That's going to be really important. Okay. The vomiting center, so the part of you that tells you to throw up, that controls that action behavior, that unfortunate event sometimes, is actually located in the medulla. So for example, let's say you eat something that's bad. The toxins from whatever it is that you ate will be registered by your digestive tract. It sends signals to your brain. Then part of your brain sends signals to the medulla that says, oh, no. This has got to come back out. There's something in this, was not healthy. And so that makes you throw up. Okay. The unfortunate, that's fortunate, but also unfortunate, because this vomiting center is in the medulla, you do not have to be conscious in order to vomit. You don't. So basically, you can be absolutely unconscious. So that's what happens with concussions, for example. People get a concussion, they decide to fall asleep, and then basically the medulla gets the signal to throw up. They throw up in their sleep, and then if they're laying on their back, they can choke on their own vomit. Same thing with someone who's passed out drunk. They can vomit in their sleep. And again, they can aspirate. So that's why it's really important when someone's had a concussion. A lot of times what they'll say is that you need to watch them for 24, sometimes even 48 hours when they're sleeping to make sure that they don't just throw up unconsciously in their sleep. Okay. There's also a cluster of neurons in the medulla that's going to function in what's known as deglutition. So here's another fancy science vocabulary word. This basically means swallowing. Okay. So that part that controls, that unconscious swallowing that you do, that's in the medulla as well. Okay. Then the next region up is the pons. So you can see the pons right in here. On this individual, it is right in here. So it's between the medulla, and I should say the midbrain, not so much the brainstem. It should be midbrain. Okay. Basically, the pons helps connect different parts of the brain with one another. So you'll have lots of things kind of relaying into the pons as well. Two of the key things that it's going to be important in is your sense of equilibrium, so your sense of balance, as well as your sense of respiration. Okay, so again, it also helps play a role in your breathing, like your normal resting breathing rate versus, taking a deep breath because of, I don't know, you've been holding it or that kind of thing. So it's going to determine your resting breathing rate as well as some of your more labored breathing. Again, you'll learn a little bit more about its role in 202. So let me talk to you guys about a fun little, I don't know, it's fun for the people who have it. However, a medical condition. The old name for it is Ondines Curse. Okay. Our modern day name for it is going to be congenital, oops, move my picture instead of drawing. It's congenital central hypoventilation syndrome or primary alveolar hypoventilation. Those are different names for it. I like Ondines Curse. It's easier for me to remember. Anyway, I'll give you sort of the background on why it got its name and then what it actually is. So basically, the story is that it's based on a German legend. So a water nymph, her name was Ondine, she fell in love with this mortal male. And if you ever read any kind of old folk stories, it's never a good idea when gods and humans match up. There's always some repercussions. Anyway, the lover, he had promised to love her with his every breath. And then he was unfaithful. Yeah, well, that didn't go over very well with the king of the nymphs. And so he said, oh, really? You're going to love her with your every breath? Well, then, you are going to have to remember to breathe. So he cursed him by taking away his autonomic physiological functions. However, it was not written like that in the actual story, right? So basically what he did, he's like, all right, you have to stay awake and remember to breathe. Because again, we breathe unconscious when we're sleeping, right? So basically what happened is that the lover could not go to sleep, and basically he ended up dying of exhaustion. Right? So the people who have Ondines Curse now, again, we call this different. We don't call it that anymore. Basically, they have to remember to breathe. It's not automatic for them like it is for us. So during the day, even sometimes they'll be hooked up to a machine that basically helps ventilate them, but definitely at night. So basically that helps them breathe so they can actually sleep. Otherwise, they would simply suffocate and die. Kind of an interesting thing. Sometimes this will happen due to brainstem damage, like due to like a car accident or some other kind of accident like that. And ever so often it's a congenital disorder. They're just born that way. So ever since they're like little kids, and the condition sometimes progresses and gets worse. So they end up just being hooked up to machines, and you kind of see them on this machine. It's got these long tubes, and they're there playing, and it's sort of, I guess, their sense of normal. Anyway, really important that you don't have to remember to do everything, right? Like breathing. So thank you, medulla and pons, for taking care of that for us. All right. So let's talk about the last part, the midbrain. So the midbrain has 4 different areas associated with it, or part of it. So those are the cerebral peduncles, the superior colliculi, inferior colliculi, and then something called the substantia nigra and red nucleus. Okay, so all these in red are all part of this midbrain. And we're going to see these 3 in lab as well. So basically the cerebral peduncles, these are going to be tracts, so again, sort of the nerves, if you will, inside the central nervous system. They're going from the motor areas of the cortex, so this is sending signals to muscles. So they're going to go from the motor area in the cortex, and this is relaying through there to the spinal cord, pons, and medulla. And then we have these 2, the superior colliculi and then the inferior colliculi. So this term colliculi is plural. So what we have basically 2 superior colliculi, 2 inferior colliculi, right? And together they're going to make up something called the corpora quadrigemina. Okay, so there's 2 superior colliculi, and you might see this in lab as colliculus. That's individual. So you have 2 superior, 2 inferior. Together they make up these 4 bodies. So quadri, 4. So corpora means body. So these 4 bodies. Okay, and they're going to do very similar sorts of things. So you can see this. The superior colliculus is going to coordinate movements of the head, eyes, and trunk. Same thing with the inferior colliculus. It's coordinating movements of the head, eyes, and trunk. The superior colliculus does it in response to visual stimuli. So basically what this is, and you've all done this, is let's say something goes darting out of your peripheral vision. All of a sudden, like you just orient your head like, whoa, what was that? Like you don't think about that. You don't go like, something darted there. I should look now. No, you don't do that. You just look. Inferior colliculus is in response to auditory stimuli. And I think this one we all kind of all had this example of, all of a sudden it's like a really loud noise, right? You're kind of like doing whatever, and loud noise, whoa, you look up. It's automatic. You don't think about it. It's just something that you do. Because again, think about it. It's really important. If something's darting at you, or there's a sound, you want to make sure that, whoa, and you automatically orient toward it, or what you think was toward it. Again, you don't think about it. You don't go like, that was a sound. I should maybe look up. Where was that again? There? No, there. Because by then the zombie has eaten your head. So basically, when you hear the sound or you see something, you look up, you automatically orient so you can react to it. Okay, so really important brain regions for survival. And then substantia nigra and the red nucleus. We'll talk a little bit more in a couple of lectures about these, just a little bit more. Substantia nigra is going to be really important in control of movement. So the substantia nigra is going to be a brain region that is really important in producing dopamine. And what we'll see is that in cases like Parkinson's disease, the substantia nigra is actually affected, not producing the amount of dopamine that it should. Excuse me, and that's when you get those tremors that's so common. Okay. All right. Let's see. All right. So we have the cerebellum right back in here, sort of behind the cerebral cortex, sort of adjacent, I guess, to the pons and the medulla. Cerebellum is going to be really important in coordinating contractions of skeletal muscles. We'll talk a little bit more about the cerebellum too in a couple of lectures, about how it actually works with the cerebrum in doing this. It helps regulate posture, balance. So what's really interesting is, well, I don't know, interesting, but you probably have all seen this in movies, if not in real life. When people drink, right, and they're really drunk, you know how their movements get really sloppy? Right, now, like, you know, they kind of stagger. It's because the alcohol has affected the way the cerebellum fires. So their balance is off, right? So the neurons aren't firing correctly. They're not monitoring, the cerebellum can't function in monitoring the precision of movements as well. So people stagger, they bump into things, right? So things like that. It also helps in motor learning. So motor learning is things like riding a bicycle, right? Like once you learn how to do that, it's the physical things that you do. Once you've learned how to do that, you know how to do that. That's motor learning. or typing on a keyboard. Once you've learned typing, you don't really think about that anymore. That's motor learning, and your cerebellum is going to be important in that. Okay, that's helping you learn those kind of motor skills. It also functions in cognition. There's some evidence that some of your memory, like the cerebellum, is going to be has some role to play in memory. They don't exactly know what, but we know that if the cerebellum is affected, there is deficits in cognition and memory and in thinking processes, as well as language processing. Now we're going to talk about specific language centers in the brain, so I don't want you to think that cerebellum is the key one, but again, it also has a function in language processing. So again, if the cerebellum is affected, there is a little bit of deficit in the way people speak and understand language. Again, not the key brain region, but it does play a role. And that is also going to be a pattern that you're going to see over and over again in this lecture, is that we'll have several brain regions, and they all really work together for the added effect of whatever that, I guess, behavior is. Okay, so whether that's language processing, we'll see several brain regions really work together so that we can produce fluent language, so that we can understand one another, so we can read, so we can write, right? So we can process language, so we can take a word and conjure up a visual image of it, right? It's not just one brain area. Okay, so, all right. So let's see. So the diencephalon, another brain region, you can see it highlighted here in red, consists of the thalamus, hypothalamus, something called the epithalamus, and then what are known as circumventricular organs. So the thalamus, I already mentioned this to you, so this round area in here, it's the major relay station in the brain, so a lot of different tracks are going to come into the thalamus, and then they'll connect with other neurons, and then they'll go to some other place. So it's basically a major relay station in the brain. So information may come in from sensory neurons, like on your fingertips or wherever. It goes to the thalamus, and that sends information to the cortex, and vice versa as well. Okay. All right, and I'll kind of hide me so you can see, or maybe I can move myself here. All right. The hypothalamus, I don't want you to worry so much about this image. I just wanted you to understand that the hypothalamus is any of these sort of clusters of nuclei that you see here. And they're all going to be a different nucleus, so you can see all the different names. Don't worry about them. You do not have to memorize them at all. I just want you to understand it's not just one giant monolithic, or I guess tiny little monolithic organ. It actually is made up of different clusters. And because it's made up of all these different clusters, it'll have a lot, as you can see here on this list, there's a lot of different functions. So it helps control the autonomic nervous system. And we're going to talk about that in the next lecture. So your autonomic nervous system is going to be your fight or flight system, as well as your rest and digest. It's all the stuff that you don't necessarily think about. Okay, we'll talk a little bit more about that next lecture. The hypothalamus produces lots of different hormones. It actually controls your pituitary gland. We'll talk a little bit more about that in 202. It helps regulate your emotions and behavioral patterns. So just kind of leave it at that for that. It helps regulate eating, drinking. So the major thirst center, for example, is in your hypothalamus. So when you start feeling thirsty, that's basically your thalamus sending that message to the conscious part of your brain going, hey, you're dehydrated. You should get some water. I'm going to make you feel thirsty, so that then makes you go and drink more water. It'll help control body temperature. So part of you achieving a fever is going to be regulated by this hypothalamus, as well as your set body temperature. It monitors that. So if it gets really hot, it'll send those signals for you to start sweating. Okay. And it'll also help regulate your circadian rhythm. So basically, for the most part, you wake up at the same time, you get sleepy about the same time, you get hungry about the same time, given an average day, right? That kind of thing, as well as your states of consciousness. So that basically means that you wake up about the same time. So you go from unconscious to conscious. You get sleepy at a certain, usually about the same time. So you go from conscious to unconscious, and all of that's going to be regulated by this hypothalamus. All right, and now it will hide me. So we have what's known as the Diencephalon or the epithalamus. It consists of two different areas here, the pineal gland and then something called the habenular nuclei. You can see that right in here. We'll learn about the pineal body, or at least see it in lab. But you should also be aware that there's this other thing called the habenular nucleus. It's all part of this larger structure called the epithalamus. That pineal gland is going to secrete melatonin, and that melatonin is what contributes to your biological clock. So it contributes to that sleepiness. And I have a question mark there because basically what they've found is the more so as you go throughout a day, right, you're producing more and more melatonin. So by the time you hit evening, you produce a bunch of melatonin, and now you are sleepy. So you fall asleep, right? They've shown somewhat of a correlation between the two. And they've also shown that some people who have a hard time falling asleep, their pineal gland is not producing enough melatonin. So sometimes for these individuals, if you give them melatonin, they fall asleep. Now, I have contributes to sleepiness question mark because that is not always the case. Sometimes some people, you can give them mega doses of melatonin and they still don't get sleepy. They still have a hard time falling asleep. So I don't want you to think that all like cases of insomnia and stuff like that can be cured by melatonin. However, some cases are due to a lack of melatonin. So we know that that's one of the things that contributes to your biological clock, to that getting sleepy at night. Okay. And then the habenular nucleus, and we'll talk more about something in a little bit called the limbic system. That's going to be the emotional part of the brain. This habenular nuclei will also plays a role in emotional responses to odors. So that basically means like you smell something like, I don't know, apple pie, and you're like, oh, I love apple pie, and it makes you feel warm and fuzzy inside, right? That kind of emotional response. Or I don't know, you smell a certain perfume or cologne, you're like, oh, that reminds me of my stupid ex, and it makes you angry or upset or whatever, or sad. I don't know, whatever the case may be. But sort of that's what I mean by that emotional response to odors. Okay. We also have in the diencephalon the circumventricular organs. So these are going to lack a blood-brain barrier. Okay. So the circumventricular organs are going to be the hypothalamus, pineal gland, as well as the pituitary gland. Okay. And because they lack this blood-brain barrier, that allows them to sample things from the blood directly. They're not, there's no middleman there. So they can monitor chemical changes in the blood. And when you think about this, this makes sense. So for example, the hypothalamus, we said one of its roles was it contributed to your sense of thirst, right? So it's going to monitor your blood to see if you're dehydrated or not. And if you are, again, sends that signals to the brain and says, hey, we're dehydrated. And then you register that as, oh, I'm thirsty, I should drink water. Okay. So it makes sense that these areas would monitor chemical change in the blood. So again, to do that, they're going to lack a blood-brain barrier. Okay. So you can kind of see the other things that they're going to play a role in: blood pressure, fluid balance, hunger, thirst, right? Again, you'll learn a little bit more about this in 202. Now, the unfortunate thing about lacking a blood-brain barrier is that these sites are particularly vulnerable to the entry of different viruses. So things like rabies virus or HIV and other viruses may gain entry to the brain through these circumventricular organs because they don't have that strong barrier. All right. And I will stop this lecture right here. So hopefully this all made sense to you. We're going to get into the cerebrum next, which is so much fun. It's one of my favorite things. So as always, email me if you have any questions, and I will see you next time.